What I didn't tell you, Phil, which might interest you, my fitter came up to me. He said, would you like to have a memento of last night's raid? And I said, what memento? And he handed me out 2 shell fragments about that long. He said, I took them out of the parachute pack that you were sitting on. The Romans had been cutting back on the defences, and as a result, the Gauls came to the gates of Rome, and that put the breeze up the Romans no end. And there was a bridge across the Tiber, and it was defended by a chap called Horatius. He was the captain of the gate. And Macaulay wrote a very good poem that went as follows. He said, remember, the Romans were terrified, but he said, up stood brave Horatius, the captain of the gate. To every man upon this earth death cometh sooner or late. But how better to die facing fearful odds for the ashes of your fathers or the temples of your gods.
Wow, that's true.
And that's rather how I felt about being a bomber crew in World War II. How better to die facing fearful odds.
It's a lesson that so many people, if they understood that.
What I didn't tell you, Phil, which might interest you, and that is that after that 5th operation, when we got bracketed by anti-aircraft and the aircraft got lifted up, in the morning, Doug and I went down and had a look at the aircraft, and the whole of the back was like a calendar. And it's a thought, you know, that if we'd been a nanosecond later reaching that point, it would have been the whole of the aircraft and not... But, as I say, when we came and looked at in the morning, while we were looking at this, all these holes in the aircraft and putting our fingers in, my fitter came up to me and he said, would you like to have a memento of last night's raid? And I said, what memento? And he handed me 2 shell fragments about that long. And I said, oh, where did you get them? He said, I took them out of the parachute pack that you were sitting on.
Wow. Yeah.
Which made me thoughtful. After the war, Dan Snow Dan Snow, the BBC man, got in touch with me, and he said, how'd you like to come over to Biggin Hill and meet a Luftwaffe pilot? And I said, not much. He's a nice little bloke. He said, we're going to give him a flight in a Spitfire. He said, anyway, you'll have a free lunch, and anybody who knows me, I'm always up for a free lunch. So I said, oh, all right, I'll come over. And so I went over to Biggin Hill. I wasn't met by Dan, but I was met by one of his aides, and the aide said to me, well, there's the Luftwaffe pilot over there, pointing to a little bloke. And as we walked towards him, the aide said to me, you know, he's had 40 kills. And I said, I don't want to meet him. He said, well, it was on the Eastern Front. Oh, I said, the Russians, well, that doesn't count. So I met up with him, and he was quite fluent. He spoke English quite well. And he said, well, you were doing your duty, and I was doing mine. And I said, well, I suppose you could put it that way. But, of course, there's more to it than that. Although the Luftwaffe chaps, by and large, were okay, behind them they had the Gestapo, and behind the Gestapo they had execution squads. So, you know, it wasn't quite right. Anyway, we shook hands and some photographs were taken. and I think he went off for his flight in the Spitfire. And somebody said to me, would you like to meet the ex-German paratrooper? And I thought, well, in for a penny, in for a pound. Suppose I started to point out. So they pointed to some rather elderly, menacing-looking guy on the other side of the hangar. And I walked across to him and I said, I gather you're the ex-German paratrooper. And he said, no, I'm not. He said, I'm Ted the taxi driver. I got the wrong man.
So I've been told that you used to take a sleep on the way back from Germany in your plane.
Absolutely right.
Go on, can you tell me about that? Because that's incredible. No autopilot, just sleeping in the plane.
Well, you've heard me say that the Mosquito could outpace any German propeller-driven night fighter. So, with this knowledge in hand, I used to trim up the aircraft at 25,000 feet, and although we hadn't got autopilot, if you were in clear conditions at 25,000 feet, the aircraft would almost fly itself. So I used to say to Doug, my navigator, look, I'm trimming up this aircraft. If you find, after I've trimmed it up, that we're straying off course, give me a nudge and I'll retrim it. And if it doesn't need trimming up, because we'd fly a straight course back to the UK, and we do a zigzag course coming in so that the German night fighters couldn't identify what the target was. But going back, we used to go straight. And so I said, if by any chance we get back to Downham Market and I'm still asleep, give me another nudge and I'll land the bloody thing, you see? So, yes, I used to put my head on a cushion and I used to catnap. But on one occasion I was going back and there was a bloody great bang under the starboard wing, and Doug comes up with another of his odd statements. He says, what was that? So I said, well, it was a shell, wasn't it? So we checked and double-checked, and there was no particular damage done that we could tell. So we went back, and I landed the aircraft, and when I was being interrogated, I mentioned this to the interrogator. And he said, where did it happen? And Doug pointed to the chart, and this guy laughed. And, well, he could afford to laugh. He used to go to bed every night and comfort and one thing and another. He didn't have to fly over Berlin, did he? And anyway, he laughed, and he said, you flew over a German anti-aircraft training school. And he said, this school would be would have largely German girls of about 17 trainees. And he said they were only allowed one shell a night. And he said, you came along, you naive couple, and they were polishing up their sights, and they let off their one shell. And I said, it was damn good shooting because it brought us down.
Another thing I wanted to ask you, and I haven't, if you have time, if you're okay, your own personal family life during the war. Did you marry? Did you have...
Well, my personal life. I was married. When I was out in America, I was sharing as a cadet. My girlfriend wrote to me, and my chap I shared the room with said, is that a letter from home? And I said, yes. He said, I don't get letters from home. Can I read it? And I said, well, it's a bit saucy. It's from my girlfriend. But I said, there's nothing in there that you shouldn't read. So I tossed the letter across to him. It was a rather long and detailed letter. and he read it very carefully. And then he said to me, if I were you, as soon as you get home, I'd marry that girl. And I did.
Wow.
And that was in 1943. A little baby came along, and as happens, and my wife was living with my mother down in Devon, and my mother wasn't the easiest lady to live with. So my wife got in touch with me and said, can you find me somewhere else to live? And I said, I think the only place I can find you is up here at Downham Market. I said, I'll have a look around and see if I can find somebody that will let us have part of the house or whatever. And I was very fortunate in finding a chartered surveyor and his wife who were prepared to let us have the top of their house in Downham Market. It was a super accommodation, and they were very kind. And so therefore my wife came up and joined me. I'd done about 5 or 6 operations by that time. But anyway, she came sailing up and she joined me. And I must say that if you have to fight a war in the air and you're lucky enough to fly and have a mosquito and you come home at night and to be kept warm by a lady who's your wife, well, you couldn't really have it much better, could you?
No, that sounds like as perfect as you could get it.
Yeah.
Who would be your Churchill of today? Who do you think could be the Churchill of today? Who could now step in and go, right, I know you could do it. You'd be my first choice.
Well, I've told you, nobody's going to listen to me at the age of 104, sadly.
Well, I am.
I wish they would. Who would I think take over as Churchill? I'm very hard-pressed to identify a politician of that calibre.
And that in itself is a problem. And that in itself is a problem.
That is really the problem.
Yeah.
See, the way to the top in politics is that you join the young Liberals or the young Conservatives, and then you go into local government and you serve in local government, and then you're selected for to stand, and then eventually you're picked for a safe seat, and you get people right at the top who've had no business experience and, in the main, no service experience. Although I had a birthday dinner on the 2nd or 3rd of March this year, and I did have the Veterans Minister there.
Al Khan's.
And he's a good bloke. He's got the MC.
Very nice.
And before
very good. A credible background as well.
And before that, I had the Conservative one, who was Johnny
Mercer.
Johnny Mercer.
Yeah.
He was good too. So I have met, I know who I would have as Prime Minister, Penny Mordaunt.
I like Penny.
Yeah.
I've met Penny a few times.
Yeah.
She has. Yeah, you're right. Actually, she could possibly step up to the plate.